Thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. This has been very fascinating, and this will be a bit of a hard left turn into somewhat more esoteric or policy discussion, but I think it will be interesting and useful because hopefully some of the ideas that I'll offer and that Marguerite will offer will be useful ammunition for the companies here when they're advocating for the need for carbon removal. I was asked just to do a short piece on kind of what is removal, just to kind of reset on definitions, but we've done a lot of that today, so I'll try to move through it quickly. But I think, what I'm channeling here is kind of what does the layperson think about when they think of removal? Because the layperson, so to speak, is quite close to the kind of person that's actually procuring CDR at the moment, that would actually, transact with Stockholm Exergy at one of these companies. So I think typically people think of removal as removal from the atmosphere. But of course, that's not quite the full picture. It's actually perhaps better thought of as removing CO2 from circulation in the active carbon cycle. And importantly, stewarding its storage in a monitored carbon stock, essentially in perpetuity. And so for me, I'm increasingly feeling like we should almost always be using the phrase carbon removal and storage, because if we're not including that storage piece, we run the risk of inviting things that aren't carbon removal in the sense that we're intending it to mean into the mix. And I like this framework from Cameron Hepburn's paper on carbon capture and utilization, where we think about these three different elements. And I think there's things that are certainly unambiguously pure carbon dioxide removal, and they don't constitute CCS or carbon capture and utilization. So that could be mineralization or ocean alkalinization without using the product in building materials. DAX, of course, is that marriage of CDR and CCS. Biochar is not CCS, but could be a utilized product if it's sold as an input. So that's at that. So I won't go through all of these combinations, but just to highlight, as I think we talked about earlier in the chat, circular fuels, incredibly important mitigation pathway, but certainly not removals. Likewise, CCS on fossil CO2 falls squarely in that CCS bucket. And then, of course, there's this whole element around avoided deforestation and improved forest management, which are the most prevalent form of carbon credit in the voluntary carbon market at the moment. And really less than 10% of the carbon credits they generate are removals, but they're often sold as a very ambiguous mix of the two. So I bring this up to say, and we did this in the Oxford Principles, we wanted to say, it's really important that there be this shift towards removals, because of course, only with removals can you actually balance sources and sinks and declare net zero. So this was our taxonomy to try to draw a bright line between avoidance and reduction and removals and not cross that line. And when we think about what that means for purchasers, the reason we're harping on these definitions is to say, the voluntary market and the compliance market will increasingly demand this clear distinction between removals and avoidance. So it's something we have to disentangle. And I think for the people on this call who are very much in the know and very much in some cases insiders in this process of defining this, I think we just have to focus on eliminating ambiguity between the two sides of the coin, and just be really forthright about what we're offering and when, and making sure that we're not marketing something as removals when in fact it's reduction or avoidance. And also this point that I raised in the chat earlier, which is just let's keep asking the question, who should be involved in defining the nitty-gritty details of what is and what is not removal, and what voices should be involved in that discussion to make sure that even if we're all approaching it with the best intentions, the potential for the public or for purchasers of carbon removal to mistrust those results is significant, and we want to avoid that happening. And I just wanted to transition into the carbon takeback point by saying, what's the role of carbon removal purchasers? And over on the right is the future state that we all want and we all know is necessary. And that is an enduring set of policies that make carbon removal the law of the land, essentially. If you're emitting carbon, well, you've got to clean it up. And that's what's going to allow companies and actors in the economy to fully internalize the costs that they're imposing on the climate system. So we all want that, and we know that that's going to take some time to get to. So in the short term, there is this demand in the voluntary carbon market. And what I've done over on the left is try to show that sort of three different ways to do carbon removal right if you're a purchaser. And I'll start from the bottom, which is maybe the best, or at least the most high impact when it comes to incentivizing early stage carbon removal. And that's, let's call it the Stripe model. That's companies contributing directly to nascent carbon removal pathways without receiving any carbon credits in return. Then there's this intermediate piece, which is something I work on quite a bit with Carbon Direct as an advisor to Microsoft, but we'll call it the Microsoft model, which is companies that go a step beyond the usual purchaser of offsets and develop actual fluency with CDR and attempt to procure carbon removal in a really intelligent way that balances the established solutions like nature-based solutions, which certainly need support, but they don't need early support to help them reduce their costs. So that's kind of the strategic procurement model. And finally, at the top, the sort of bare minimum that buyers should be doing is adhering to something like the Oxford Principles or the SBTI guidance, where you say, we might not be buying 100% removals now, but we're shifting towards removals over time, and we're shifting towards permanent storage of carbon over time. And so that brings me to this piece right here, which is, how do we get that enduring policy framework? So I'm going to introduce this idea of carbon takeback, and then I think Marguerite's going to take it further and get into some of the details, specifically how it relates to, or how it could be adapted to specifically support carbon removal. So switching gears now to discuss carbon takeback and what is it? And I think this idea was piloted by Miles Allen as early as, I think, 2009. So I'm doing my best to channel Miles here. I think the first insight, there's sort of two insights that the policy proposal is based on. The first is that actually most of the benefits from emissions accrue upstream. So it's the fossil fuel extractors who have the highest value that they're accruing from the act of digging up carbon. But few climate policies are actually harnessing that payer, that source of value. Secondly, as we all know, as we've been discussing today, the most expensive mitigation that we need to do is this permanent carbon storage, whether that's through CCS, direct air capture, BECCS, all of these, quite costly activities that we know we're going to need to do en masse. And conventional climate policies are completely failing to incentivize those activities early enough so that they'll be ready in time. So carbon takeback basically just takes those two insights and smushes them together and says, why don't we just require the permanent storage of carbon as a condition of taking out more carbon from the ground? So that's at its essence what's meant by carbon takeback. And so, at the moment, the only real sort of enduring or sustainable way of keeping carbon stored is through geological storage, but it could, of course, also be mineralization, perhaps even biochar. Really, any method that can store carbon with a low risk of reversal is an appropriate means of counteracting, continued fossil emissions if we want to have that in an enduring net zero state. Of course, there's going to be efforts to conflate this with, the ability of nature-based solutions to decarbonize fossil fuels, and we would argue that, while nature-based solutions need to be scaled to their maximum, it's not an appropriate way of counteracting fossil carbon emissions, and there's lots of reasons we can go into there, but I think we have to move along for the sake of time. So in terms of the sort of geophysical insights behind the carbon takeback obligation, I mean, we start with something very familiar, which is just the emission decline that we need to achieve Paris goals. So starting from 35 billion tons of emissions from energy and industry and dropping to 0 on net. But of course, we know that net is not the same as gross. And in 2050, in mid-century, we expect that there will still be significant gross CO2 emissions. So that's why emissions on the left are basically composed of however much CO2 you produce, that's in the center, minus however much CO2 you permanently store, that's on the right. So the blue lines are actual results from Paris compliant integrated assessment models. This isn't sort of we're not imposing this idea, we're just observing this from the models and saying, you know what, in all of the scenarios that meet the Paris goals, we see this scale up of permanent storage. But what if we turn that on its head and we said, well, what percentage of CO2 that we dig up, carbon that we dig up, are we storing? And that's this idea of a stored fraction, which is really just however much carbon you store divided by however much carbon you dig up. And what we notice is that in all of the Paris compliant IAMs, that percentage gets to 100%, of course, by mid-century. That's what net zero means, right? It means any remaining fossil CO2 extraction is balanced with permanent storage. So we see that escalating relatively rapidly to towards 100% in 2050. Now, the idea here is, what if we made a climate policy that was driven by that stored fraction? I'm going to skip this piece and say that's the idea behind carbon takeback. So what if we required all fossil fuel suppliers to store a rising fraction of the CO2 in their products, increasing from 0% today to 100% in 2050? What does that look like in terms of Paris compliance? Well, we see that for all of the scenarios that meet Paris goals, you need to be storing something on the order of 10% of the carbon that we're extracting by 2030, as much as 50% by 2040, and of course, as we said before, 100% by 2050. Now, how would you implement a policy like this? Well, the simplest method, but there are definitely other designs, would be to draw a region that's adopting the carbon takeback obligation and actually require this escalated stored fraction. So you'd have carbon storage units representing 1 ton of CO2 permanently stored that can then be traded among the obliged entities who are essentially competing to store carbon at least cost. So what you get is the desired outcome, which is early storage of carbon at actually a relatively low cost. And that's what I'll describe here before closing and handing off to Marguerite. So the economics at play here are that, if you have this gray curve, which is a hyper stylized projection of what permanent storage will cost, right? So something on the order of $100 a ton today, and then shifting towards the long-term price of DAX, which hopefully will be lower than $250 a ton by 2050, but humor me with the conservatism of that assumption. And so but the stored fraction, the amount of carbon you have to store, is relatively low in the early years. And so if you put that together, this red line is showing you the cost to comply with the carbon takeback obligation, which is under $50 for all of the 2020s and 2030s. It's a very low additional carbon price to be stacking on top of whatever you're doing. So it has very little impact on the economy, but for all of that storage that's happening, you're ensuring that outcome. You're ensuring that these volumes of storage are happening in the early years so that these technologies can get going. And the flexibility of the policy allows you to include, essentially mandated fractions, not just for permanent storage in total, but perhaps specifically for carbon removal, which I think Marguerite will talk more about. So, why adapt carbon takeback? I'm not going to run through these because we're running out of time, but just focus on the final point at the bottom of the slide, which is really, as we're lobbying and acting within the European policy context, within national governments, with companies, the question we should always be asking is, for anybody that's involved in taking carbon out of the lithosphere and pumping it into the system, what fraction of that carbon will you be permanently re-injecting by 2030? And if it's less than 10%, we're not on track to net zero. So that's a useful framing, we think, and the basis of this particular policy concept. I think Marguerite can take it from there, but please do reach out and check out our website, and please email me with any questions. Thank you.